Hi, this is Craig Stocks. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I put together this image of the Elephant Trunk Nebula, mostly focusing on the Photoshop processes because the way I do it I think is quite a bit more simple than a lot of the tutorials that I see online. So I wanted to talk through a fairly simple approach to colorizing a monochrome image. So this is the finished image in Photoshop. So let's just start from scratch. Now what I've already done is stack both the hydrogen and the oxygen data in Deep Sky Stacker. So we want to load those two monochrome images as two layers in a Photoshop document. So I can go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and just click on Browse to pick the two files that I want. And I should have in this folder, along with a lot of other stuff, I'll have the Elephant Trunk Oxygen from Deep Sky Stacker and the Elephant Trunk Hydrogen from Deep Sky Stacker. So click OK and then OK again, and that will load those two files. And again, these are from a monochrome camera, so these are black and white or monochrome images coming into Photoshop. And those will show up in the Layers panel as two separate layers, one for oxygen and one for hydrogen. And because I clicked one of the hydrogen layers as, or one of the original hydrogen files as a reference frame, the stars are aligned. So right now the oxygen is on top, and if I turn that on and off, you can see the stars are aligned. And what we want to do is create a HOO image, which would be hydrogen, oxygen, oxygen, meaning that hydrogen is assigned to the red channel and then oxygen is assigned to the green and blue channels. And this is where I see an awful lot of tutorials online that go through creating duplicate documents and copying and pasting and loading into the different channels, and that's just a lot of honking around. The easy way to do it is we'll start by first converting this into a color image. If we go to Image Mode, you can see the check mark is next to grayscale, and that's because grayscale images were created by the camera and then again out of Deep Sky Stacker. So if I just choose RGB color, and we don't want to merge these two layers, that will create the red, green, and blue channels so that now we have a color document. And what I want to do is use the blending options to control the channels. So if I look at the name here, and this is the Elephant Trunk Oxygen, if I just double click on this layer, and that will bring up a panel that has the advanced blending options along with other styles that we can apply. And you'll notice kind of in the center you've got the different channels for red, green, and blue. So and they're all checked, so all three are turned on. If I uncheck the red, then that will include only the green and blue channels from this layer. Click OK, and I now have a color image with red assigned to the to the hydrogen layer. And it does that by default because this bottom layer has the hydrogen data, and right now, because it's a monochrome image, that is red, green, and blue, all three channels. So it has the same information in all three channels. If I turn the oxygen layer on, the oxygen layer is not including the red channel from this layer, only the green and blue. So that creates an HOO image. Now it's pretty flat. It needs a lot of stretching to bring out the subtle details. But notice that it does have the color, it does have the texture, and because we're including basically equal amounts of red, green, and blue, the stars are primarily white, although some of the brighter stars do have distinctive colors. So we actually have natural color in the stars, somewhat natural color in the nebula, and you can even see, at this point we can still see where there are double stars although as we start stretching, a lot of that may blur and kind of bloom and blend together. So we want to stretch these, and the easiest way to do it, or one of the most effective ways, is to stretch the layers independently. So let's start with the hydrogen layer, and for the moment I'm going to turn off the oxygen, and we'll just add a curves layer, and I'll drag down on the shadows and up a little bit on the midtones to create more mid-tone contrast. And I want to be careful that I don't raise the highlight portion of the curve, because that's where you really start to do damage to the stars and they start really bloating. So now we've just added a lot of contrast to the hydrogen, and we want to do the same thing to the oxygen. So I'll turn on and because this layer, by the way, is below the oxygen layer is unaffected by this curve. It's only affecting what's below it. When I turn on the oxygen layer, and you'll notice the colors have gone kind of wonky because we've applied a curve to basically to the red channel. If I now target the oxygen layer and add a curve to that layer, what I want to do is make sure that this curve only affects the oxygen layer, and I do that by clipping this adjustment layer to the layer below it, and I can do that with the little icon here on the curves channel, or curves adjustment layer. If I click on that, now this curve will only affect the oxygen, and I can make the same kind of adjustment of darkening the shadow region and maintaining some contrast in the midtones. I want to be somewhat careful that I don't, if I move this too far down, you'll see how we get a flat bottom on the S curve. Generally, you don't want that. You want to maintain some curve all the way, and again, we want to be careful with the highlights. And by adjusting the brightness of the shadows, we can actually change the color. If you look at the background, we can make it more red or more blue just by how we brighten or darken these individual channels. And you may find that as you do this, if you actually merge these curves and apply them to the layers, it may give you a more precise view of what's happening. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. Generally what I would do at this point is just add another curve above all of this and continue doing adjustments, but this time adjusting that composite image to try to tease more contrast and color and detail out of the base image. And then from this point, it's basically just whatever kinds of Photoshop processing you like to do. You may run filters for smoothing out the background or making stars smaller, things like that. You might just save this as it is and do some finishing work in Lightroom. It's really up to you from this point on. There's 100 different ways you can go. The main thing I really wanted to focus on was this technique of simply choosing which channel to include from a layer, and that maintains the data from each one of those channels, the oxygen and the hydrogen, in a very adjustable form so that you can make fine-tuning adjustments as you go along without having to dip into the channels and work non-destructively. So this is kind of a fundamental way I process most of my images. There's probably at least a half dozen ways to add color to monochrome images, but this is one of the easiest, if not the easiest, and many times it's very effective, and it's all you really need to do to turn a set of monochrome layers into a color image. If you have any questions, be sure to ask them in the comments. Again, this is Craig Stocks, and thanks for watching.